My name is Agnes Chiao, and I'm a Community Impact Director with United Way of Salt Lake. Our mission is to improve lives by bringing people and resources together to solve our community's most serious problems. In 2007, United Way of Salt Lake did a community assessment. We do a community assessment every 2 years or so. And one of the issues that we found was language barriers and cultural differences. And to address that issue, we were working with a group of donors that specifically chose this issue to work on. And the solution that they found was Workplace ESL. So I was actually brought on to implement this Workplace ESL program. Once we actually started to research this issue and begin to implement the program, we found that Workplace ESL had already been implemented in our community with a lot more resources than we were already able to raise. And so what we did is we took a step back, we slowed down a little bit, and instead of going straight into implementation phase, we went back to the drawing board with our community stakeholders. We brought together private businesses as well as public officials, both from the state and from the county level and the city level, as well as our nonprofit community partners, organizations that are on the ground working with immigrants and refugees. We brought this group together to talk about, well, what is the issue? What is really going on in our community? We understand there are some language barriers, we understand that there's some cultural differences, but what is it really that we want to achieve? What as a community do we want to accomplish? And we didn't really have the framework to be able to articulate that at that point. People were talking about ESL, they were talking about success for students in school, they were talking about employment, and they were talking about how communities were divided, but they didn't really have a way to talk about integration. And we didn't really find that framework until we got connected to GCIR, and they were able to give us a wonderful language, a framework to begin to be able to talk about this work. That was how our immigrant and refugee integration initiative was developed. We started off in the best practice and pilot grant area. We have a few grants out currently. One is to a coalition building organization. So one of the things that through GCIR we learned, looking at different states and best practices in other areas, is that there's usually a robust coalition that drives a lot of the grassroots and grass tops and systemic change in our community. And we didn't have an organization like that. We didn't have a coalition like that. And so one of our grants was to an organization to build this community grassroots coalition to really build community leadership for their voices to become the main voices for change. So that's one of our critical program grants. The second grant that we do is a Welcome Center grant. And actually this concept came from the GCIR convening. We went to the GCIR convening and it was a great networking opportunity. And we also went on these local site tours. And one of the site tours that I participated on was the Welcoming Center in Chicago, Illinois. And although it's state-run, it was a really interesting model to us, where you bring resources together, different types of programs together to facilitate access to these services for immigrants and refugees. In Salt Lake, we already had some of that happening. There was an apartment-based model called the Heartland Complex, run by the University Neighborhood Partners, that was providing resources and services and programs through an apartment that had a lot of refugees in that apartment complex. So we took a conglomeration of that model that was already existing in Salt Lake and what we learned through our site visit on the GCIR convening at the Welcoming Center in Chicago. And we took those two things together and built a model that would work for Utah. And we are currently funding 4 different welcome centers. 2 of them are apartment-based, 1 is in a school, and 1 is actually located in a city complex. But however, the city is kind of the local resource in that community. So the idea behind it is that you provide resources and you provide services where immigrants and refugees are naturally convening, as opposed to having them come to all of these different agencies to get services. All of those services are working together in one location that is easily accessible for immigrants and refugees. In the other two areas of our initiative, which is research and policy and also education and outreach, in the policy area, we have been working extensively on state legislation. Contrary to popular belief, Utah is actually a very welcoming state. So we actually have in-state tuition availability for undocumented immigrants. We have a driving privilege card available for undocumented immigrants. We have state money that's going into our refugee resettlement program. And we have a lot of policies that are mostly positive and welcoming to newcomers in our state. It has been a great pleasure to work with GCIR, and I really believe that our initiative work would not be where it is if it weren't for the impact that GCIR had on our organization. They provided resources, research, one-on-one consulting, hours and hours of conversation. They also provided us with network building, put us in touch with other people in other states that are doing similar types of work. As a pre-emerging gateway state in Utah, we're in a very different place than a lot of states that have been working on this for numerous years. And being able to use GCIR as a sounding board to figure out what's the right path for us to take, who we should connect to, how is that working for us. It's been amazing for us to have that sounding board to be reflective about our work and think about the next direction, the next step. They provide so many resources to us, and not only in the sense of the toolkit, but also the webinars, the GCIR convening. They've just been our #1 resource for everything when it's come to this work. And I really don't believe that our initiative would be as robust if it weren't for the fact that GCIR was there pushing us along and giving us advice and telling us that we were on the right track. So, these are definitely challenging economic times, and this is definitely challenging work. Immigrant and refugee integration is not something that is easily talked about in communities, which to me, it's all the more reason why we need to do this work. It's probably the issue that oftentimes we want to push under the rug, or it's so complicated that we don't even know where to begin. And that's where GCIR was really able to help steer us in the right direction. We wanted to start very, very small on workplace ESL, which is like this tiny little piece of the issue that we're talking about, and we blew it up astronomically to this huge immigrant and refugee integration initiative. And it would have been really easy for us to have gotten lost in that transition. And GCIR was able to come in and really provide stepping stones for us to figure out how do we go from being something really specific to being something really large, but also show impact and results to our donors and also see the change that's happening in our communities. Because this is such a political topic, and the climate is one with the recession, it's very much fear-based, which feeds into this divisiveness that's already in our communities. I think our challenge will be to figure out how do we come together as communities and how do we find the commonalities as opposed to focusing on the differences, and build strong communities that are diverse, that are cohesive, that are working together to find the solutions. And GCIR has really been able to talk us through how do we begin to do that? How do we begin to bring our communities together, which to me is the hardest part of integration. And it's great that we have such a resource like GCIR to be able to walk us through that and tackle this really important issue, very complicated, very difficult issue. And they really focus on not only programmatic issues, but also systemic change. And they also focus on the diversity piece, building diversity, building cohesion between our communities, which is, I think, very difficult.